8 men came back the same evening. They came back down the valley road from the direction of Blind Man's Branch, walking in a loose group, not talking to each other, and the people in Tecumseh who saw them arrive noted that they looked the way men look when they have agreed, without discussing it, to wait until they are alone before they decide what to think about something. They went to their separate homes. They did not gather at the store or the post office to talk about where they had been, which is what men who had spent a day doing something together would ordinarily do. They simply dispersed, and by nightfall they were behind their own doors, and the doors were shut. The other 3 men came back over the following 9 days, separately, from different directions. The first walked out of the timber from the south on the second day after the group's return, on a Tuesday afternoon, onto the county road near the Stotts place, about 4 miles from where the search party had originally gone in. He was a man named Ward Ellison, a timber cruiser by trade, and he was known as someone who could find his way out of any piece of woods in Ozark County with his eyes closed. When Iva Stotts came out of her house and asked him what had happened, he said he had gotten turned around. She said this was not possible for Ward Ellison in country he had worked for 20 years. He didn't say anything else. He accepted a glass of water. He walked home. He sold his timber cruising equipment within the year and took a job at the mill in Gainesville, where the work did not require him to go into the trees. The second man walked out of the timber from the west 6 days after the group's return in the early morning. His name was Cecil Maupin. He had been listed in the Ozark County Missing Persons log after 3 days because his wife had expected him back and had not seen him, and had begun, quietly, to prepare for what she thought was the worst kind of news. When he appeared at the edge of his field just after dawn on the 6th day, she ran out to meet him. He was in good physical condition. He was not injured. He could not account for 6 days. He told his wife he had slept in the woods. He told her he had eaten what he could find. He told her the woods were larger than he had thought they were. She asked if he was all right. He said yes. He was not, in the subsequent decades, all right in the particular way that a person who has gone into a place and come back changed is not all right. Not dramatically, not in any way that would show up in a record, just differently calibrated, as though something had been adjusted inside him that he had not chosen to have adjusted. He died in 1967. He never spoke publicly about the 9 days. His wife said, in a single recorded conversation with a county historian in 1971, that he had never spoken of it at home either, except once, in the winter of 1933, when he told her in the dark that there were more of them than anyone knew. She asked what he meant. He said, "I counted." He answered nothing else that night. He went to sleep. He never brought it up again in 34 years of marriage. The third man walked out of the timber from the north on the 9th day, and the direction was the detail that people in Tecumseh found most difficult to account for, because north of Blind Man's Branch was ridge country so broken and steep that a man coming through it in 9 days would have had to be moving, by some estimates, almost continuously. His name was Roy Pitcher. He was in poor physical condition when he arrived, thin, with hands torn from brush and eyes that the doctor who examined him described as having a quality of adjustment, as though he had been looking at something very different and was relearning ordinary distance. He was kept at the doctor's home for 2 days. He ate. He slept. He recovered, physically. The doctor noted in his patient log that Pitcher had been cooperative and calm throughout his examination, and that he had answered every question about his physical condition clearly and accurately, and that he had declined once to answer a single question about where he had been. The question the doctor asked was, "What did you see up there?" Pitcher's answer was, "Nothing you need to know." The doctor wrote that in his patient log. He wrote it verbatim. because it was the kind of answer a doctor writes down when it is given in a tone that makes the question feel, in retrospect, like the wrong kind of question. Roy Pitcher lived in Ozark County until his death in 1958. He had no other public contact with the matter of Blind Man's Branch. His name appears in no account of the 1931 search until a local historian named Douglas Ware compiled a summary of the incident in 1989 using records from the Ozark County Sheriff's Office and personal interviews with surviving relatives. Ware's summary is 7 pages long. It is the most complete account of the 1931 search that exists. It ends, on its 7th page, with a note in italics that reads, "Several details gathered in the course of this research have not been included here. The researcher judges that their inclusion would not serve the purposes of historical documentation." The note gives no further explanation. Ware is still living in his 80s in West Plains. He has not responded to requests for comment on the summary or on what those details were. Blind Man's Branch runs off the North Fork of the White River in a part of Ozark County where the hills are old enough to have grown tired of being hills, and the timber is dense enough that a man standing at the creek's edge cannot see the ridge above him. The name is old. It appears on a territorial survey from 1817, labeled without explanation, in the same way that Sorrow Fork was labeled without explanation in West Virginia 2 years later, as though certain places acquire their names from something other than the events that happen in them. The 1817 survey notates the creek's existence and its approximate course, and then, at the point where the creek bends north toward the ridge, adds a notation in a smaller hand. Beyond this point, not surveyed. The notation gives no reason. The survey proceeds to the next drainage without comment. The Ossler family established itself at Blind Man's Branch in the early 1860s. The precise date is unclear because the first deed in Ossler's name, filed in 1861, describes the transfer of land as though a prior claim already exists. The language of the deed refers to the property as currently occupied by Gideon Ossler and family, rather than the language of a first purchase, which would typically describe a transfer from a prior owner. No prior owner is named. The deed records no consideration. It is, legally, a document establishing a claim that the county chose to formalize without asking too many questions about its origins. The man who filed the deed on Ossler's behalf was the county recorder, a man named Phineas Beale, whose signature appears on hundreds of routine documents from that period. His signature on the Ossler deed is the same as all the others. His personal diary, donated to the County Historical Society by his great-niece in 1974, contains an entry for the date of the filing. The entry reads, "Recorded the Ossler instrument today. I have done stranger things for men I understood less. At least Ossler makes no pretense." The diary does not say what Beale understood about Ossler. It does not say what the pretense would have been. It moves on to weather and crops with the thoroughness of a man who kept diaries because he believed in the discipline of daily record, not because he believed in revisiting what he had written. The 1870 census records the Ossler household at 11 members. The 1880 census records it at 23. The enumerator who conducted the 1880 census in the Blind Man's Branch area, a man named Thomas Alt, made an unusual procedural note in his district summary. He noted that the Ossler enumeration had taken him the better part of 2 days, owing to the size of the family and the difficulty of establishing relationships. He noted that several household members he had attempted to list had declined to give ages, or had given ages that he found inconsistent with their apparent condition. He noted that he had listed what he had been given and had moved on, because to do otherwise would have required him to stay a 3rd day, and he did not want to stay a 3rd day. He gives no reason for not wanting to stay. He resigned from his position as census enumerator shortly after the 1880 count was completed, citing a desire to return to farming. He had been an enumerator for 6 years and had shown no previous inclination to leave the work. His resignation letter is in the Federal Census District files at the State Archives in Jefferson City. It is 2 sentences long. The first sentence resigns his position. The second sentence asks that he not be considered for future appointment. The request was honored. He was never appointed again. The 1890 census records no Ossler household at Blind Man's Branch. By now, this is a familiar pattern in this account, familiar enough that the absence itself feels less like an explanation and more like a habit, the record choosing, in its practiced way, to stop seeing what it cannot satisfactorily explain. The 1900 census records 4 Osslers. The 1910 census records 2. Neither of these entries specifies which members of the household are recorded. They give only names and ages. In 1900, Aldous Ossler, age 41, and Cora Ossler, age 69. In 1910, Aldous Ossler, age 42, and Cora Ossler, age 70. Cora Ossler, recorded as 39 in 1870, would have been 79 in 1910, not 70. The ages do not track correctly across 4 decades of census records, the way ages sometimes fail to track when the recording is done by estimate or when the subjects choose not to correct the record. Aldous Ossler, recorded in 1900 as 41, is listed in 1910 as 42, 1 year older across 10 years. This is not a small discrepancy. This is not a rounding error or a matter of the census being taken in different months. It is a man who aged 1 year in a decade. No one appears to have noticed this in any official capacity. The census records are filed correctly. The ages are what they are. Among the uncatalogued portion of Douglas Ware's research files, held at the County Historical Society, is a single scrap of paper that does not belong to any of his numbered folders. It reads only, Yancey County, North Carolina, same clause? Nothing in Ware's published summary explains the note. Nothing else in his papers mentions Yancey County, North Carolina at all. Harlan Pruitt was one of the 8 men who came back the same evening. He was 50 years old in 1931, a farmer, a man who had lived his whole life in Ozark County and who had no history of fancy or exaggeration. When the search party was organized in Tecumseh to go up Blind Man's Branch after 4 months of uncollected mail, Pruitt volunteered because he knew the country and because he was not the kind of man who did not volunteer when something needed doing. He went in with 10 other men at first light. He came back with 7 others before dark. He told his wife, in the winter of 1932, what he had seen. His wife repeated it to their daughter in 1961, 30 years later, at the end of a conversation about other things, as though it had been waiting for that long to come out. The daughter repeated it to Douglas Ware in 1989, the historian, who included it in his summary in the form of what he called partial testimony, transmitted through 2 removes. He published the substance of it. He published it as follows. Harlan Pruitt had entered the hollow above Blind Man's Branch with the other men. He had seen the structures the Ossler family was known to have built. He had seen no Osslers. He had seen other things that he told his wife he could not fully describe, because he did not have adequate language for them, and he was not a man who used that kind of excuse lightly. He had turned around with the other 7 men before reaching the upper end of the hollow. He did not say what had made them turn around. He said the decision had not been discussed. It had simply happened, the way breathing happens, as though the body had made the determination without consulting anyone. What he told his wife, at the end of the account, the single detail she repeated to the daughter, the detail the daughter repeated to Ware, the detail Ware published word for word because he judged that its precision mattered, was this: Pruitt had counted, as the group turned to leave, the number of figures he could see in the hollow. He did not call them people. He said figures. He counted 14. He had gone in with 10 other men, which meant 11 in the party including himself. Of those 11, 8 came back that evening. The other 3 came back over the following 9 days. 14 figures, 11 searchers. He stood at the edge of the count for a long moment, by his wife's account of his telling, and then he told her, in 4 words she never forgot, and that Ware later printed exactly as she gave them, that the rest weren't theirs. He did not say what he meant by that. He did not say it again. Deputy Fenn Coble drove to Blind Man's Branch in the spring of 1933 to follow up on an anonymous complaint, the nature of which is not recorded because the complaint form has been removed from the county files and only the dispatch notation survives. His report is 4 pages. The 4th page, the page that presumably contains his findings and recommendations, has been removed. The staple that held the 4 pages together is still there. The hole the staple made in the remaining 3 pages is still there. Page 4 is gone. The remaining 3 pages describe the route to Blind Man's Branch, the condition of the access road, the weather on the day of the visit, and the difficulty of the creek crossing below the hollow. They contain no information about what Coble observed. They are detailed and carefully written, and they read, with some attention, as the work of a man filling pages until he reached the one that mattered, at which point he removed it, for reasons that the remaining 3 pages go to some trouble not to explain. Coble remained with the Sheriff's Department for 6 more years. He retired in 1939 and moved to Springfield. He died in 1952. His son, reached by telephone by a researcher in 1991, said that his father had been a private man, not given to talk about his work. He said he had never asked his father about specific cases. He said there was one thing he remembered, though, and that was that his father had kept, for as long as the son could remember, a particular habit when he came home from work. He would come in the door and he would wash his hands, even on days when his work had been administrative, even on days when he had not left the office. Every day. The son had asked about it once, when he was young, and his father had answered only that some days you needed to. The son did not know which day had started the habit. He said it had been there for as long as he could remember. Vera Trout was 91 years old when she was interviewed in 2019. She had grown up 2 ridges east of Blind Man's Branch, near enough to have heard about the Osslers from the time she could hear, far enough to have lived her life without going to find out. She had been thinking about it for 91 years, she said, which meant she had earned the right to say what she thought. She was not asked a question. She simply began. She said the Osslers had been at Blind Man's Branch before anyone remembered them being there, and that people in the county had always known this, the way you know things that nobody taught you. Not from being told, but from the quality of the silence when the subject came up. She said the 1931 search party had gone up there and had seen what was there to be seen and had come back different, and that this was not a surprise to the people who had lived their whole lives in that county, because you do not go to certain places without them going with you afterward. She was asked what was at the upper end of the hollow. She looked at the interviewer for a moment with the sharp, measuring look of someone deciding how much patience they have available. She said, "More of them than there should be, given what the record says." She said it without drama, the way a person states a fact about arithmetic. She was asked if she had ever been up there herself. She hadn't. Asked if she ever intended to, she said only that she was 91 and had managed this long without it. She folded her hands. She looked out the window. The interview was over. The mail route to Blind Man's Branch was discontinued in 1931, following the search party's return, and was never reinstated. The county road that accessed the hollow was formally abandoned in 1947. The land at the upper end of the hollow is listed in the Ozark County Assessor's records as unimproved, privately held, owner of record, Ossler Estate. The taxes are assessed annually. They are not paid. The county issues a delinquency notice annually. The notices are mailed to the last known address, which is the hollow, and they are returned undelivered because there is no one at the hollow to receive them, or because whatever is at the hollow does not consider itself responsible for them. The delinquency continues. The land remains listed. The name remains on the rolls. There is a second set of records in the Ozark County Archives that touches on Blind Man's Branch without naming it. A series of surveying field notes from 1958, prepared for a highway expansion project that was ultimately routed elsewhere, includes a section on terrain assessment for the North Fork of the White River drainage. The surveyor's notes for the Blind Man's Branch tributary area contain an observation that sits in the middle of a standard technical description like a stone in a road. The observation reads, "Evidence of habitation at the Upper Creek, current. Nature of habitation not assessed. Recommend alternative routing." The alternative routing was adopted. The highway went elsewhere. The habitation was not assessed. The surveyor's name is in the field notes. He retired from state service in 1961. He lives in Joplin. He has not been contacted for this account because the people who have looked into this matter have found, over time, that some of the most useful information is already in the record, and that the record, if you read it carefully and completely, without looking away from the parts that are harder to look at, tells you most of what there is to know. Not all of it, but enough to understand why 8 men came back the same evening, and 3 came back separately over 9 days, and why Cecil Maupin said in the dark in 1933 that there were more of them than anyone knew, and why he had counted. Enough to understand why Ward Ellison sold his equipment and took a job at the mill. Enough to understand why the mail stopped. Enough to understand what Vera Trout meant when she said she had managed 91 years without going up there, and that she intended to keep managing. The North Fork of the White River still runs below the hollow. The branch still comes down off the ridge the way it always has. The land at the upper end is still privately held, still listed, still generating a delinquency notice that no one collects and no one pays. And in the Ozark County Assessor's Office, on the shelf where the active delinquency files are kept, the Ossler file sits between 2 other files in the ordinary way, thicker than most because of the accumulated notices, and the clerk who has managed that shelf for 11 years has learned not to pull the Ossler file without good reason, because the file is always in order, always correct, and yet pulling it produces in her, every time without exception, a sensation she has described to no one but herself, in the privacy of her own understanding, as the feeling of being observed from a direction she cannot turn around to check. She is a practical woman. She does not believe in much she cannot see. She pulls the file when she needs to. She puts it back when she is done. She does not leave it out. The Methodist minister who passed through the Blind Man's Branch area in 1864 and recorded a description of Gideon Ossler was a man named Eustace Whitmore, and his travel journal is held in a regional Methodist archive in Kansas City. He spent 3 days in the area, visiting homesteads along the North Fork drainage, conducting informal prayer services, and recording his observations with the diligence of a man who believed that the ordinary details of frontier life were worth preserving. His journal for those 3 days is thorough, warm, and specific. His entry for the day he visited the Ossler place runs to 11 lines, which is shorter than any other household entry in the journal. He records that he arrived at the property, that he was met by Gideon Ossler at the fence line, that he was not invited inside, and that the conversation at the fence lasted approximately 20 minutes. He records Gideon's physical description, as noted above. He records that Gideon declined to join him for prayer, citing a preference for his own forms of worship, and that when Whitmore asked what forms those were, Gideon had said, "The kind that preceded yours by a considerable time." Whitmore records that he had taken this as a reference to older Protestant traditions and had not pressed the point. He records that he had ridden away from the property with a feeling he describes as the feeling of having conversed with someone who has already read the book you are in the middle of. The entry ends there. The following entry is for the next day, at a different homestead. In the margin beside the Ossler entry, in a hand that appears to be Whitmore's own but written at a later time, the ink is slightly different, the pressure slightly heavier. He has added 3 words. The 3 words are, "I was right." He does not say what he was right about. The addition is not dated. It could have been made the following week or 20 years later. Whitmore kept his journals throughout his career and appears to have revisited them occasionally. The Ossler entry is the only place in 30 years of journals where he added a marginal note to a previous entry. The archive has confirmed this. The woman who manages the Methodist archive, reached by telephone in 2021, confirmed the journal, confirmed the marginal notation, and confirmed that no explanation for it exists elsewhere in Whitmore's papers. She said she had read the journal when cataloging it and had found the notation interesting. She was asked if she had done anything else with it. She said she had cataloged it correctly and moved on to the next item, which is her job, which she has found is usually the correct response to things that do not fit neatly into a category. She said this in the tone of a woman who has made peace with a large number of things that do not fit neatly into a category. The traveling Methodist minister who passed through the Ozark County hill country in 1864 and spoke to Gideon Ossler at the fence line and rode away with the feeling of having conversed with someone who had already read the book he was in the middle of, that minister would not have known about the Quelch family in Yancey County, North Carolina, who had also chosen land that didn't need to be cleared, who had also chosen a hollow where the water ran a color that had no name, who had also persisted in the record long past the point where persistence should have been possible. He would not have known because there was no way to know, no connection documented, no correspondence, no shared name. But there is a single land record in the Ozark County archives, filed in 1877, that records a transfer of 50 acres at the upper end of Blind Man's Branch from a party identified as the Ossler family to a party identified only as the Quelch interest represented. The transferee is not named as an individual. The deed is brief. The consideration is unstated. The Quelch interest, whatever it was, received 50 acres of ground at the upper end of a Missouri hollow in 1877, and the record of that transaction sits in the deed books in the correct order, correctly indexed, available to anyone who asks for it. No one who has researched the Ossler family has previously noted this deed. The 50 acres at the upper end of Blind Man's Branch are included in the current delinquency notices issued to the Ossler estate. The Quelch interest is not separately listed. It has not been separately assessed. It is simply there, in the record, the way certain things are simply there. Not announced, not explained, present in the way that things are present when they were placed deliberately and with the expectation of being found only by someone who had reason to find them. Someone, someday, will pull that deed. The clerk who manages the delinquency file has not pulled it. She knows the Ossler file by its weight and by the sensation that comes with handling it, and she has found that knowing a thing by these qualities is sufficient for her purposes. She does not need to know more. Most people, given sufficient time in the presence of the record, arrive at the same conclusion. Most people. The North Fork still runs. Blind Man's Branch still comes off the ridge. The hollow is still there, at the end of a road the county abandoned in 1947, past a creek crossing that washes out every spring and that no one repairs, because repairing it would require someone to go out there regularly, and no one who lives in that county has shown, in the 93 years since the search party went in and came back changed, any sustained interest in going out there regularly. The mail stopped in 1931. No one has complained about the service.